You've probably driven past a man like him without slowing down. The one who builds the strange thing nobody asked for. The one the whole town agrees is wasting his life on a hole in the ground. We laugh at those people. I laughed at this one. I want to be honest about that before I tell you the rest, because the laughing matters. It's the part I can't take back. What I can tell you is this. There is a particular kind of silence that comes right before a mountain decides to move, and once you've heard it, you'll spend the rest of your life listening for it. I heard it on a Tuesday, and the man we'd all called a fool turned out to be the only person in that valley who'd been listening for it his entire life. Stay with me. I'm a slow teller, but I promise you the snow is coming, and I promise you that what he'd buried in that hillside was never what we thought it was. The first thing I remember is the sound my own boots made, and how wrong it was. You learn the language of your own land if you live on it long enough. 41 winters I'd run cattle in that valley, and I knew the crunch of dry snow, the squeak of cold powder, the slush suck of a thaw. What I heard under me that morning was none of those. It was a low hum coming up through the soles of my feet, a vibration with no source, like standing too close to a transformer. The horses felt it before I did. My old roan, Dutch, had stopped dead in the corral with his ears pinned flat and his nostrils wide, staring up at the north face of Caldwell Ridge like the mountain owed him money. I've kept a logbook every day since I was 19 years old, weather, calving, repairs, the small grudges of ranch life. That morning I'd written 4 words before I went out: still, too still, warm. I didn't know yet that those would be the last ordinary words in that book. The next page is just a coffee stain and a line I scratched so hard the pen tore through. It had snowed for 6 days. Then on the 7th it warmed, that false, lying warmth that comes down off a Chinook and convinces you spring's arrived in February. The eaves wept. The drifts went gray and heavy. Old Pete Lindqvist, who ran the feed store and considered himself the valley's unofficial almanac, said it was nothing, said he'd seen it 100 times. Pete said a lot of things. I tend to fidget with my grandfather's pocket watch when a man's talking nonsense at me. It doesn't run anymore, hasn't since the 80s, but I wind it anyway, click, 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 and Pete always took it as agreement. It was the opposite of agreement. Because I'd felt the hum, and there was exactly one person in our valley who, I knew, would understand what the hum meant. His name was Daniel Tasse. You have to understand how we talked about Daniel before any of this. I'm not proud of it. I'm telling you so you'll trust me later. Daniel was Apache, mescalero on his mother's side. He told me once, though he'd been raised half off the reservation and half on it, shuttled between a grandmother who taught him things and a father who drank, and a stretch of foster homes that he never described and I never asked about. He'd bought the old Hennessy place at the foot of Caldwell Ridge maybe 9 years before, paid cash, which set every tongue in the county wagging about where a man like that got money like that. He was quiet in a way that people mistook for sullen. He was patient in a way that people mistook for slow. He was neither. He was just a man who decided early that most talk was a waste of breath, and he spent his words like a poor man spends coins, carefully, and only when something could be bought with them. What he spent his years on, instead of talking, was the hill. He started digging the autumn of his 2nd year there. Not a basement, not a root cellar, something bigger, set into the slope behind his house, angled into the mountain itself. He hauled rock. He poured footings by hand, mixing concrete in a wheelbarrow, 1 barrow at a time, for an entire summer. He cut timber and notched it and dragged it on a sledge behind a mule because he wouldn't run a skidder over ground he said he was trying to keep quiet. He laid stone walls 2 feet thick. He built buttresses that leaned into the hill, not away from it, which made no sense to any of us, and a roof of layered log and earth and sod that by the 3rd year just looked like part of the slope, a green-brown swell with a low timber-framed mouth. From the county road you couldn't even see it. That was the point, though none of us understood that either. We just saw a grown man spending 9 years burying a building. We had names for it. Pete called it Tesse's Gopher Palace. The Harmon boys called it worse. My own nephew Cody, and I should have stopped him. I didn't used to say Daniel was digging his own grave the slow way. Real considerate of him, saves us the trouble. Everybody laughed. I laughed. God help me, the day Daniel hauled the last of the sod up that slope and stood there sweating with his hands on his hips looking at the thing like a man looks at a newborn. I drove past and lifted 2 fingers off the wheel and thought, what a waste. What a waste of a strong back and a sharp mind and 9 good years. He could have expanded his herd, built a proper barn, married maybe. Instead he put it all into a hole. I asked him once, only once, leaning on his fence with a thermos between us because his coffee was better than mine and we both knew it. I asked him why. He didn't answer for a long time. He had this habit of letting a question sit, turning it over like he was checking it for cracks before he'd carry it. Then he said, "My grandmother lived through the winter of '49 up in the mountains. Whole families went under. She used to say the people who lived were the ones who'd listened to the old folks instead of laughing at them." He looked up at Caldwell Ridge, at the great smooth white sweep of its north face hanging over the valley like a held breath. "That mountain isn't a mountain, Cal. It's a thing that's waiting. People forget that. The ground remembers what people forget." I thought it was poetry. Nice talk from a quiet man. I clicked my dead watch 3 times and changed the subject to cattle prices. "I'm telling you this so you understand," he warned me. In his way, he warned all of us, and we heard it the way you hear a sermon as a sound, not a meaning. So the Tuesday. The hum was in my feet. Dutch was losing his mind in the corral, and I did the thing you do when something's wrong and you don't have a word for it. I went looking for the one person who might. Daniel's truck was gone from the Hennessy place. That stopped me cold because Daniel never went anywhere on a warming day after a heavy snow. He told me that too, that the dangerous days were the warm ones, that he kept close to home when the snowpack went soft. The fact that he'd left meant something had pulled him out. I found out later what. The school. The valley's only school sat down in the low ground where the 2 creeks met, and that February the building was hosting the regional fiddle contest. Of all the foolish things, a Tuesday recital and competition that had drawn half the families in the county down into the bottom of the valley. Kids in their good clothes, grandparents on folding chairs, Pete Lindqvist working the coffee urn. 100 and some people packed into a gymnasium directly below the north face of Caldwell Ridge. Daniel had heard the hum too. Of course he had. He'd been listening for it for 9 years. And while I was standing dumb in my corral winding a watch that didn't run, he was already driving down to the bottom of the valley to do the one thing a quiet man hates most in the world. He was going to have to make noise. I got there maybe 10 minutes behind him. I'll carry the shape of what I saw for the rest of my life. The gym doors were propped open against the warm air, and the sound of a child playing Soldier's Joy came spilling out across the parking lot, sweet and clumsy and so painfully ordinary. And there in the doorway was Daniel Tesse, big quiet Daniel, with his hat in his hand and his voice raised, for the first time I'd ever heard, trying to convince a gymnasium full of people to get up and leave a fiddle contest. I caught the back half of it as I came across the lot. He was telling them about the snowpack, the warming, the wait, the 6 days of fall sitting on a slick base layer, the way the whole north face was loaded and waiting. He was telling them, in plain words, that the mountain was going to come down today, maybe within the hour, and that they were all sitting in the exact place it would land. And I watched the room not believe him. I watched it the way you watch a slow accident. Mr. Abernathy, the principal, had his hand up, placating, the way you talk to a man you've decided is unstable. Pete actually laughed, I heard it, that bark, and said something about the Gopher Palace, and a ripple of relieved chuckling went through the folding chairs, because here was the strange digging man being strange in public, and that was easier to understand than a mountain falling. A mother pulled her kid a little closer, not toward the door but away from Daniel. Somebody told him to sit down or leave. The fiddle had stopped. The child on stage was starring. Daniel stood there with his hat crushed in his fist, and I saw something cross his face that I'd never seen on him in 9 years, not anger. Anger I could have understood. It was grief. He was watching 100 people decide he was a fool, and he already knew, the way only he could know, exactly what that decision was going to cost. That's when he found me with his eyes across the whole crowded room. Found me, the man who'd lifted 2 fingers off the wheel and thought what a waste. And he didn't say a word. He just looked at me and the look said, "You felt it too. I know you did, help me." And here is the morally heavy thing, the thing I have to tell you even though it doesn't make me look good. For one full second, I hesitated. I hesitated because everyone was laughing at him, and I did not want them to start laughing at me. 41 years in that valley, and the thing that froze me solid in a doorway with a mountain coming down was the simple animal fear of being thought a fool by Pete Lindqvist. I'm not going to pretty that up. That's what it was. Then I felt the hum come up through the gymnasium floor, louder now, into my knees, into my teeth. And I saw the basketball hoop's net begin to sway with no wind to move it, and the second was over. "He's right," I said, my voice cracked on it. "Everybody, he's right, we have to go now." It's a strange thing to learn in one moment, how little your word is worth. I'd thought in some vain corner of myself that I was respected in that valley. 41 years. And I stood up next to Daniel and threw my whole reputation behind him, and it bought us, maybe a dozen people, maybe 15. The Harmon family, because old Sue Harmon had grown up in Avalanche country and the fear was older in her than the pride. A young couple with a baby, because the mother had been watching the mountain through the high windows and had seen something the rest of us hadn't. A handful of others who simply trusted that 2 grown men don't make fools of themselves in a doorway for no reason. The rest stayed. Pete stayed, arms folded, almanac certain. The principal stayed, herding people back to their seats. Let's all just settle down. Most of the families stayed because their children's names were still on the program, and you do not abandon your child's recital because the local eccentric had a feeling. Daniel didn't argue anymore. That was the thing that finally scared the ones who left. Daniel stopped arguing. He just turned and started moving people out the door fast, his hand on shoulders, his voice gone low and even again, and the contrast between the shouting man and this calm one was somehow more terrifying than any amount of yelling. He'd said his piece. He'd been heard and disbelieved. Now there was only time, and you don't spend time on talk. "Where?" I said to him in the lot, getting people into trucks. "Where do we take them? Your place is 20 minutes. "The shelter," he said. "The Gopher Palace, the waste, the hole in the mountain." "It'll hold," he said, and for 1 second that grief crossed his face again, looking back at the lit gymnasium and the warm music starting up once more inside, the child on stage lifting her little fiddle to finish Soldier's Joy for a room that had decided to stay. "It'll hold all of them. I built it to hold all of them. A breath. They just won't come. I will tell you the rest. I'll tell you what the mountain did and what was inside that hill that none of us had understood, and the choice Daniel made when the snow stopped falling and we counted who we had and who we didn't. I'll tell you about the sound the gymnasium roof made, which I still hear, and about what Pete Lindqvist said to Daniel 3 days later with his hat in his hands. But you should know before I go on that the snow was already moving when we slammed the truck doors. I felt it. Daniel felt it. He looked up at the white face of Caldwell Ridge one last time, and his lips moved, I think in his grandmother's language. I never asked. And then there was that silence I told you about at the start. The silence that comes right before a mountain decides to move. There's a thing nobody tells you about a mountain coming down. You expect a roar. You brace for thunder. What comes first is the wind. We were strung out along the county road in 3 trucks and a hatchback when it hit us. A wall of air that arrived before the snow did. A pressure front the slide pushed ahead of itself like a fist pushes a curtain. My windshield went white not with snow, but with the powder cloud the avalanche threw a 1/4 mile out in front of its own body. The hatchback ahead of me, the young couple, the baby slewed sideways on the road, and I stood on my brakes and felt Dutch's empty horse trailer try to jackknife behind me, and through it all, under it all, came the roar at last. Not loud. Felt. It came up the steering column into my hands. The whole valley was a drum and something enormous was beating it. I looked left up at Caldwell Ridge. In the half-second I had to look. The north face was moving. The entire white sweep of it, acres of snow, was sliding as one piece. And then it wasn't one piece anymore. It was breaking into blocks the size of houses. And the blocks were breaking into a churning gray-white river. And the river was eating the timber at the foot of the slope, 100-year pines snapping off at the base, and vanishing the way a man's hat vanishes into a flood. It did not look like snow. It looked like the mountain had turned to liquid, and remembered it had always wanted to reach the valley floor. The gymnasium sat directly in its path. I want to be careful here because the people inside that building were my neighbors, and some of them I'd known since they were children, and I will not turn what happened to them into a thing for you to gawk at. I'll only tell you what I saw, which was the powder cloud reach the school first, a soft thing, almost gentle, the way fog rolls over a fence, and then the body of the slide arrived behind it. The lights in the high windows went out, not flickered, out, the way a candle goes out between two fingers. And then there was no gymnasium to look at anymore, only a moving gray field where a building had been, and the field kept moving, and the roar went on, and I realized I was shouting something with no words in it, just sound, my own voice doing what the mountain had refused to let Daniel's do. Daniel's truck was in front of the whole line. He'd put himself first on purpose to break trail, to set the pace, to be the one the slide reached first if it reached the road at all. It didn't. The slide spent its fury on the low ground, and the deposit fanned out and stopped 100 yards short of where we sat. We were close enough that the edge of the powder cloud frosted us white and the wind rocked the trucks on their springs. But it stopped. The mountain, having taken what it wanted, lay still. And then it was so quiet that I could hear the baby in the hatchback start to cry. Here is something I learned that day about Daniel Tesse and about myself. In the silence after the slide, every instinct I had screamed, go dig. Go to the deposit, claw at it with my hands, find the gymnasium, find the children. It's the right instinct and it's the wrong one. A debris field that size fresh is not stable. It can settle, it can shift. A second slide can come down the chute the first one carved. Untrained men flinging themselves at it die, and then there are more bodies to find. I knew this in theory. In that moment, theory meant nothing. My hands were already on the door handle. Daniel was suddenly there, his palm flat against my window. He didn't shout. He'd done his shouting and it had cost him. He just held my eyes and shook his head once, and I watched him fight the same fight I was fighting and win it, because he'd been preparing to win it for 9 years. We can't dig, he said when I rolled the glass down. His voice was rough. Not yet, not like this, not us, not now, he swallowed. I called it in the second I left my place. Search and rescue, the county, the airbase, they're coming, they have dogs, probes, beacons. We dig blind into that and we just bury ourselves with them. A muscle in his jaw worked. And there's more coming down, look at the chute. I looked, he was right, there was a second mass hanging up there, undercut, ready. The mountain wasn't finished. It was just reloading. So what do we do? I said, and I hated how small my voice was. We get these people somewhere it can't reach them, he said, and we get them warm before the cold finds them, and we wait for the people who can dig. He looked back at the deposit field, at the place his neighbors lay under 20 feet of compacted snow, the people who'd laughed at him an hour ago. The grief was on his face again, but it had gone hard now, set, load-bearing. And we pray the ones down there made an air pocket. That was the whole of it, the terrible arithmetic of a man who'd studied his enemy. He could not save the ones who'd stayed, not with his hands, not now, not without becoming one of them. He could only save the ones who'd come. So he turned his back on the buried gymnasium, which I think was the hardest single thing I have ever watched a human being do, and he started getting us up the hill to the hole he'd dug. The mouth of the shelter was a low timber frame set into the slope, and you had to duck to go through it. And once you were through it, everything I thought I knew about Daniel Tesse rearranged itself. Because it was not a hole. I'd pictured a root cellar, a damp stone box. What we came down into was a vaulted room maybe 40 feet long, the ceiling arched in fitted timber over those 2-foot stone walls, the floor laid in flat rock and swept clean. There were bunks, actual built bunks, 3 tiers down both long walls, enough to sleep 30. There was a barrel stove vented up through the earthen roof with a length of pipe he'd buried so the smoke came out 100 feet away through rock, invisible. There were shelves. Stacked, sorted, labeled shelves, dry goods in sealed buckets, water in carboys, blankets in moth-proof trunks, lanterns, a first aid chest the size of a footlocker, a hand-crank radio, splints, a folding stretcher, sacks of grain, candles by the gross. There was a second stove for cooking, and a third, smaller room behind a curtain that I'd later understand he'd built as a sick room, because his grandmother had told him that in a disaster the dying and the living should not have to look at each other all night. 9 years, 1 wheelbarrow of concrete at a time. A man we'd called a fool had been quietly building an ark in a hill, and he'd built it big enough. I did the arithmetic standing there with snow melting off my collar. He'd built it big enough for the whole valley, for everyone who'd laughed. "You built this for us," I said. I don't know why it came out as an accusation. Maybe because the kindness of it was unbearable. Maybe because I'd lifted 2 fingers off a steering wheel and thought what a waste, and now I was standing inside the waste, and the waste was the only warm room left in the world. Daniel was already moving, lighting lanterns, opening the stove, all business. "I built it for whoever'd come," he said, not looking at me. "I always knew most wouldn't." A pause, his back to me, his hand resting flat on the cold iron of the stove. "I just hoped I was wrong about how many." There were 19 of us in the shelter. I counted twice, the way you count when the number is the only thing your mind can hold. 19 out of the 100 and some who'd been at the recital. The Harmon family, 6 of them. The young couple, Marisol and Ben, and the baby, whose name was Iris and who had stopped crying and was now sleeping against her mother's chest with the obscene piece of a creature too small to know. Old Walt, who'd come because he trusted me. The Peterson sisters. A schoolteacher named Joan who'd had no children in the program and so had no reason to stay and every reason to flee, and who I would watch over the next hours turn out to be the strongest person in that room. A few others. And Daniel. And me. And then the cold came for one of us, and the night truly began. Old Walt, 83, all bone and stubbornness, had been chilled to the marrow in the powder blast and the shock of it, and somewhere in the scramble up the hill his old heart had taken a wrong turn. He went gray in the lantern light and slid down the stone wall, and Joan the schoolteacher caught him before his head hit the floor. Daniel had him into the sick room inside a minute, had the small stove roaring, had the first aid chest open, and was working over the old man with a calm so total it was its own kind of medicine. And I stood in the curtained doorway useless as a fence post, while the schoolteacher and the Apache rancher we'd all mocked kept a man's heart beating with their 4 hands, and a bottle of aspirin, and the heat of a stove he'd built for exactly this. Walt lived. I'll tell you that now, because the not knowing is cruel and I won't do it to you the way the night did it to us. Walt lived, but for 2 hours we didn't know it, and during those 2 hours the hand-crank radio brought us the rest of the world. Search and rescue was coming, but the second slide Daniel had seen hanging in the chute had come down. We'd heard it, a muffled second drumbeat through the earth, and felt the older ones flinch, and it had buried the county road in 2 places. And the storm that the Chinook had been hiding was now coming in behind it, real winter, and the helicopters couldn't fly into it. The diggers couldn't reach the deposit field until the weather broke. They were telling us, in the flat, patient voice of a dispatcher doing the hardest job there is, that no one was coming until morning at the earliest, and that we should shelter in place, and that they were sorry and stay warm and don't lose hope. The people under the gymnasium had been buried for 3 hours by then. And every single one of us in that warm stone room knew the math, even the ones who wouldn't say it. A person in an avalanche burial has, if they're lucky, if they made an air pocket, maybe a few hours before the air goes bad. Some last longer. Most don't. By morning, the people we'd left behind would almost certainly be beyond any help that any digger could bring. That was the night Daniel had to make his choice, and it was not the choice you'd think. I'd assumed, somewhere in the back of my fear, that we'd all just stay put. That was the sane thing. That was what the radio said. We had heat and food and walls and a sick old man who couldn't be moved, and outside there was a debris field that could shift, a second chute that could load again, a blizzard coming down. Every rule of survival, every rule Daniel himself had taught me leaning on that fence, said stay in the shelter you have. But Marisol, the young mother, Iris asleep against her, had a sister. Her sister had stayed for the recital. Her sister's 2 children had been on stage. And around the 4th hour, when the radio had gone quiet and the storm had begun to moan across the buried mouth of the shelter, Marisol stood up with her baby in her arms and said, in a voice that did not shake, that she was going down to the deposit field to dig for her sister, and that no one had the right to stop her, and that she understood she might die, and that she was going anyway. You could feel the room split. Half of us wanted to hold her down. Half of us, and I'm ashamed it took her courage to show me which half I was in, half of us understood that there are things worse than dying, and one of them is sitting warm and safe knowing your sister's children are suffocating in the dark a half-mile away while you do nothing. And Daniel, who had been the loudest voice for stay, wait, don't dig, you'll only bury yourself, Daniel stood up, and I watched the choice happen on his face. The whole of his 9 years was in it. Everything his grandmother had told him about the people who lived being the ones who listened to the old folks. Stay in the shelter. Stay in the shelter. It was the truest thing he knew. And he looked at this young mother, and at the baby in her arms, and at the rest of us, and I watched him weigh the certain safety of 19 against the impossible, probably hopeless, almost certainly fatal chance of a few souls under the snow. And I watched the man who'd built a fortress against exactly this kind of foolishness decide to walk out into the storm. Not you, he said to Marisol, and before she could fight him, you stay, Iris stays, you don't get to make her an orphan on a chance. His voice was gentle and it left no room. You stay and you keep Walt alive and you keep this room alive because if I don't come back somebody has to know how to feed the stove. He was pulling on his coat as he spoke and his hands were steady, and his eyes when they found mine were not steady at all, they were a man saying goodbye. Cal and me will go, we know the ground. We've got beacons, I've got beacons for everybody, there's a whole crate. Did you not see? A short broken sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. The only crack he let show all night, 9 years, and you'd think somebody might have asked what I was keeping in here. He threw me a coat. He threw me a beacon and a collapsible probe and a headlamp and a shovel, all of it stockpiled, all of it ready, all of it bought and stored and waited with by a man we'd called a fool, for the exact night we were now living. You don't have to, he said to me quiet, just the 2 of us by the buried mouth of his shelter with the storm screaming on the other side of the timber. This one's mine to make, not yours. I thought about the 2 fingers I'd lifted off the steering wheel. I thought about the 1 second I'd hesitated in the gymnasium doorway because I was afraid of Pete Lindqvist laughing at me. I thought about 41 winters of knowing this valley and never once, not once, listening to the only man who'd actually been listening. I wound my dead grandfather's watch. Click, click, click. It still didn't run. Nothing I owned ran when it mattered. Hell, I said, somebody's got to keep you out of trouble. And we ducked through the low door into the dark, into the wind, into the snow that had already taken so much and was not, by the sound of it, anywhere near finished. 2 men with shovels walking toward a buried building in the teeth of a blizzard, on the strength of a young mother's love, and the slim, savage hope that somewhere under all that white, somebody had made an air pocket and was still breathing. What we found down there and who, And the thing Pete Lindqvist said to Daniel afterward with his hat crushed in his hands, that's the last of it. I'll tell you in part 3. I'll only say now that not all of us who walked out that door walked back through it, and that the snow, before the night was over, had one more thing to teach us about what is a waste and what is not. I have tried in the years since to describe to people what it is like to dig for living souls in the dark and not know if any of them are still souls at all. I've never gotten it right. The closest I've come is this. It is like praying with your hands, while a part of you that you'd rather not have stops believing the prayer is heard. We went down off the hill rope together, Daniel and me, his headlamp a small brave cone in a world that had decided to be nothing but snow. The blizzard had come in full now, that hard mountain snow that doesn't fall so much as fly sideways and find the gaps in your collar, and the wind made the kind of sound that, if you've never heard it, you'll have to take my word for. It was the same low silence that is not silence I told you about at the start, only it had grown a voice. It moaned across the deposit field like the field itself was grieving. Daniel moved across that broken ground like he could read it. I suppose he could. He'd spent 9 years learning the alphabet of snow while the rest of us were learning nothing. He found the edge of where the gymnasium had been by some logic I never followed, a change in the way the surface humped, a difference in how it took the probe, and he stopped and put his fist up, and we listened. You're supposed to listen in a burial. The dogs and the trained crews do it as a science. We did it as desperation. You shut off your own breath and you listen for the muffled sound of someone else's life under the pack. We knelt there with the storm trying to peel us off the mountain, and we listened. And for a long time there was only the wind and my own heartbeat, and the small electronic ping of the beacons Daniel had handed out. The avalanche beacons that he'd stockpiled by the crateful, that nobody had ever once asked him about, that were now the only reason we had any hope of finding anyone at all. Because some of the people in that gymnasium had been wearing them. That was the thing I didn't understand until that night. Daniel hadn't just built the shelter. For 9 years, quietly, he'd been giving things away. A beacon clipped to a kid's backpack at the start of ski season, told it was a fun gadget. One tucked into the Harmon's truck. One pressed into the hand of the principal, Abernathy, who'd put it in a desk drawer in the gymnasium office and forgotten it. The fool digging his gopher palace had been seeding the whole valley with the means of being found, on the off chance of exactly this, and being thanked for none of it, and being laughed at for all of it. The receiver in Daniel's glove began to ping faster. We found Abernathy first, the principal, who told Daniel to sit down and stop frightening people. The beacon in his desk drawer led us to him. He was 11 feet down and he was gone, had been gone, I think, since the first instant, before the cold or the air had any chance to matter. Daniel knelt by him in the wind, a moment with his head bowed, and then we kept moving, because the cruelty of a rescue is that you cannot stop to grieve the dead while the living are running out of air. The dead will wait. Only the living are on the clock. The beacon pings braided together and pulled us 30 feet east, and we dug, God, we dug. 2 men and 2 shovels against 20 feet of set snow, which is not like digging through powder. It is like digging through styrofoam packed into concrete. And 4 feet down Daniel's probe went soft and he dropped flat and put his ear to the hole and his whole body changed. Tapping, he said. Tapping, Cal, somebody's tapping. I have never dug like I dug then. I had no shoulders, no back, no age. I was just a thing that moved snow. And we broke through into a pocket, a small dark air pocket the size of a closet that some quick-thinking soul had clawed out and held open with a folding chair. And inside it were Marisol's sister and her 2 children and a 4th person, all 4 of them blue-lipped and half-conscious and alive, breathing the last sips of their failing air. And the oldest child, a boy maybe 10, had been the one tapping on the underside of a chair with a quarter he'd had in his pocket. Tapping for 3 hours in the dark on the chance that the man who'd given his backpack, a funny clip-on gadget, had been telling the truth. That's 4. We got 4 out of that pocket. We got them up and onto the surface, and Daniel wrapped them in the foil blankets he'd carried out in his pack, and we sent the boy, who could still walk, stumbling up the rope line toward the shelter glow with the others, and we turned back to the field, because the beacons were still pinging and there were still names under the snow. I told you not all of us who walked out that door walked back through it. I have to tell you the rest now, and I find I don't want to, which I suppose is its own answer. It was the second chute that did it, the one Daniel had pointed at hours before, the one that had loaded and come down once already. Snow on a mountain does not fire once and go quiet. A slope that has slid is a slope that can slide again, and the storm had been laying fresh weight on the broken ground above us the whole time we dug. Daniel knew this. Of course he knew this. He'd been reading that exact danger off the mountain for 9 years. He just kept digging anyway, because the beacons were still pinging, and because he was the kind of man who, having decided to walk out into the storm, did not get to also be the kind of man who walked back too soon. I was 20 feet downhill from him, working a second pocket, when I heard it. Not a roar this time. A whump. A soft, almost polite settling sound, the sound the whole slope makes when it decides, all at once, to let go. I will not describe the next part in detail. It's not mine to make into a scene. I will only tell you that Daniel Tesse, who had spent 9 years learning exactly how a mountain kills people so that he could keep people from being killed, was standing in the one place on that field where the second slide ran, and that he had time. I have gone over it 10,000 times. He had time to throw himself downhill toward me, toward the cleared ground, toward safety. He threw himself uphill instead, toward the pocket he'd just opened, toward the woman whose hand he'd just reached. He covered her with his own body. They found them like that, the two of them, when the proper crews finally got in at first light with their dogs and their probes and their numbers, found her alive in the curl of him, breathing, and found him not. He'd shielded her from the second slide the way the hill he built had shielded the 19 of us, the way he'd shielded this whole valley for 9 quiet years that not one of us had thanked him for. He'd made himself a shelter, the last one, the smallest one. I got dug out by the morning crew. I'd been caught at the very toe of the second slide, buried to the chest. And I lived because I was downhill and lucky, and because Daniel had thrown me his spare beacon an hour before without my even noticing he'd done it. He'd clipped survival onto me the same way he'd clipped it onto a schoolboy's backpack, quietly, expecting no thanks, and it was the reason a dog found me before the cold did. I came up out of the snow into a gray dawn with the storm finally breaking, and the first thing I saw was the line of foil-wrapped survivors being walked down off the hill. And the second thing I saw was the place where they were uncovering Daniel. And the third thing I did was sit down in the snow and weep in a way I had not done since I was a boy, in front of strangers in orange jackets, for a man I had called a fool. Here is the part about Pete Lindqvist, because I promised it to you, and because of all the things that happened it might be the one that stayed with me hardest. 12 people died under that gymnasium. We found 6 of them alive, the 4 in the first pocket, the 2 Daniel pulled before the second slide, one of whom was Marisol's sister, who is alive today and has a 3rd child now, and named him Daniel and does not apologize to anyone for it. 6 saved, 12 lost, out of the 100-some who'd been there. 19 of us walked into the hill on Daniel's word and 18 walked back out. The arithmetic of that night is the kind you carry, not the kind you finish. Pete Lindqvist had stayed. Pete, the almanac, the man who barked out a laugh in the gymnasium doorway and said the Gopher Palace bit, and started the chuckle that rippled through the folding chairs and helped 100 people decide to disbelieve a man who was telling them the truth. Pete had stayed, and Pete should have died. And Pete was one of the 4 in the first pocket, pulled out blue and gasping by the very man he'd mocked, because the boy with the quarter had tapped and Daniel had heard. 3 days later, after the roads were cleared and the dead were brought down, and the valley had begun the long business of not being a valley that this had happened to, Pete Lindqvist drove out to the Hennessy place. I happened to be there. I'd been there most of those 3 days, not knowing what else to do with my hands, helping the cousin who'd come to settle Daniel's affairs, sitting in the shelter that still smelled of wood smoke and the lives it had held. Pete stood at the low timber mouth of it and would not come in. He had his hat off. He turned it around and around in his hands the way I turned my dead grandfather's watch, and he looked at the hill, at the green-brown swell of the thing he'd named the Gopher Palace, the thing he'd helped make 100 people laugh at, the thing that had saved his life. And Pete Lindqvist, who I had never once in 40 years heard short of words, stood there with his mouth working and nothing coming out, because there are no words for what you owe a man you helped kill who died saving you anyway. "Gave me a beacon," Pete finally said, "not to me, to the hill. Years back, said it was for elk season. I left it in the truck. Never even," his voice broke clean in half. "It's what they found me by, the thing I laughed at. It's the only reason," and he stopped and he put his hat back on and he got in his truck and he drove away, and I have never to this day heard Pete Lindqvist make a joke again. He sold the feed store the following year. Some men can carry a thing like that. Pete couldn't. I don't blame him. There are nights I'm not sure I can either. I want to end this where it started, with the question. I drove past this man's life's work for years and I thought, what a waste. A strong back, a sharp mind, 9 good years, poured into a hole in a hill. We had a word for him and the word was fool, and we were so sure of it, so comfortable in it, that when he stood in a doorway and told us the plain truth we laughed, and the laughing killed 12 people, and I will carry my 1 second of hesitation in that doorway until they put me in the ground. But here's the thing the snow taught me, the thing I write in my logbook now on the warm days after a heavy fall, when the eaves start to weep and some part of me starts, helplessly, listening. A waste is a thing that comes to nothing. And that hill came to 19 lives one night and to 6 more under the snow, and to a baby named Daniel who has a mother because a quiet man stockpiled beacons nobody asked for, and to a boy who learned that tapping a quarter on a chair in the dark is a prayer that gets answered if the right fool's been listening. That hill is still there. The county wanted to fill it in, liability, and the valley wouldn't let them. We keep it stocked now. All of us. We take turns. Pete's name was on the list before he left. There's a beacon for everyone in this valley in a crate by the door, and we know what they're for now, and we don't laugh. I go up there sometimes and sit in the dark of it and wind my watch that doesn't run. Click, click, click. I keep thinking one of these days it'll catch, the spring will take, the hands will move, that time will start again, that I'll get to be the man who didn't hesitate. It never does. Some things you don't get to fix. You only get to carry them and to dig when the tapping comes and to stop every single warm February you have left and listen for the silence before the mountain moves. He heard it for 9 years before any of us heard it once. I think about that on the worst nights. How long he must have been listening. How lonely it must have been to be the only one in the whole valley who could hear the thing coming, and to build against it with your own 2 hands, 1 wheelbarrow at a time, knowing, he said it to me himself, his back turned, his hand on the cold stove, knowing that when it finally came, most of us still wouldn't follow him in. He built it anyway. I don't have a tidy way to finish this. I've started to a dozen times and torn the page out every time. So I'll just tell you the last true thing I know and let you make of it what I've never been able to. The snow's coming again this year. Heavy fall, then a chinook off the south, the eaves already weeping. I felt the hum this morning, faint, in the soles of my boots. And this time, God help us, I think the whole valley felt it too.